There is a date, and we don't know exactly how long it is, and that's and whether it's 2 months or 3 months or 4 months, when those jobs just go away because those firms close down. That's really a function of how much money, how much aid, essentially, Congress decides to pump in there.
That's
And
why credit is so crucial. Yeah, that's why credit is. We're all living on credit right now, and we need the financial system to remain intact to be able to provide that. And that's why the interventions by the Fed were so critical in March. I mean, again, you're ending up lending money to people who are rich and everything else. But what that enables you to do is to sustain the credit system, because, as you're saying, we need that to get us through.
well, and I want to
We really need. Yeah.
I want to talk about the disparity too of lending. I mean, obviously, we need to lend, and we lent to basically wealthy people and wealthy institutions that can lend credit to other people. But by doing so, what we're also doing is increasing wealth inequality. We could have theoretically provided this credit essentially to everybody else, which would have been in the form of far more generous, let's say, unemployment insurance or direct payments, or even things like congratulations, you're now on free healthcare. I mean, all of those are in some form essentially providing credit that we can basically relieve, can basically say, we're going to forgive that debt, incidentally, 6 months down the road. But that credit that that the government essentially provided for people is basically just keeping everybody in sort of this sort of stasis, and paying everybody to just sort of protect society in some fashion. And at this point, we've only provided credit for one segment of the economy, and one which ultimately, like, that's going to run out at one point too. So, I mean, do we have a sense of where we'll start to see this first, assuming no more money? Like, what generally in the economy, where you would have where consumer spending starts to dry up? We're seeing it obviously with like small businesses, right, and restaurants and whatnot, because they don't have the capital to maintain that stasis. Where
they've got bills to pay, rent bills to pay, and they're in real trouble. I think we're going to see it above all in the sectors that were vulnerable anyway. Before this crisis hit, we spent a lot of time talking about the increasing inequality, not just in American society between higher and lower income households, but also in the business sector, between the superstar firms, if you like, and those that were just getting by. And there's a huge part of the US economy, like every other advanced economy, that really is just getting by. Most of the profits in business as a whole are made in that superstar group that dominates the S&P 500. Everyone else is just kind of, really hanging on. And a shock like this tips those companies over the edge. And the sort of places that you're really going to see it is the famous, the long-awaited collapse of certain sorts of retail model, which I think probably are going to get the coup de grace in this crisis. Even on Broadway, where I live, if you walk up and down, you've got an Urban Outfitters, for instance, a sort of classic victim of this process, which announced early on in the lockdown, the 23rd of March was their last day that they were going to be open. That outlet is shut, and everyone who works there has probably lost their job forever. So those are the sorts of sectors where I think we're really going to see this, where we're going to see the permanent damage being done. Those are sectors which have been traditionally employers of a lot of women, female workers, middling levels of education. They've been one of the places that middle-class American families have gone to sustain themselves, as the classic blue-collar male jobs have gone away. And those jobs now, the jobs done by women, are also in considerable risk. So those are the sorts of sectors where I'd look to see the damage.
I mean, it's almost, I guess, to extend that metaphor with the tsunami, these are the sort of the low-lying flats near the beach, essentially. And then the higher ground are these big, massive mega firms that essentially...
And they come out of this stronger, I think. Their competition gets wiped out. Relatively speaking, they come out of this stronger. And as you're saying, but almost by default, if you take a society characterized by large inequality and then you put it through a crisis like this and you try and rescue it, the people that swim ashore, the people that are able to take advantage of the government support, even if the government is in fact in its own way trying to counter-steer against this, tend to be those with the best connections, with the best banking connections, with the best lawyers, accountants, and so on. And they get their noses in the trough first. And so it's not surprising. I think the last figure I saw was that only 5% of American small businesses have seen any payout yet from the payroll protection plan.
Right. Well, there's not going to be. Very, I mean, there's simply. Yeah. There was simply not enough money, but B, it went to, like you said, if you have like concierge service at your bank because you're a big client, you're going to get in there first, and that's it. And because the banks themselves are determining who they're going to send to the, they're determining the order of the applications they're going to send to the SBA.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the banks felt incredibly uncomfortable about it. Like, banks under normal circumstances do a lot of kind of quasi law and order type of, money laundering enforcement, all that kind of stuff. We're all familiar with the paperwork that's associated with that. Now, all of a sudden, as you say, they found themselves in this process of doing a kind of selection of the companies. That was built into the legislation that the banks are going to have that job. I mean, they'll receive fees for it, but nevertheless, it's
apparently they got paid fairly handsomely. But the problem is that they're conflicted in terms of who they're going to put first in line, because they obviously want to put their better clients in first in line because they want to make sure that those clients stick around.
Absolutely. And that is the brutal logic of this kind of process, right? I mean, we end up supporting the big players because the big players also employ a lot of people and they matter to the welfare of the American economy. It's a kind of triage, right? It's operating at the level of the economic system. And it cuts against the desire to be egalitarian. It cuts against the desire to preserve the little guy, who at that moment just doesn't have the same systemic importance as propping up a really big employer. We might all want to come down hard on the airlines because they treat their customers so shabbily, and we know what they've been doing with their profits over the years. On the other hand, they're really large employers. They're crucial to the regional economy to many parts of the US. And after all, when this is all done with, we're going to have to fly again. So, the impulse to regulate and to discipline an actor that has basically been, all study after study has shown, taking advantage of an oligopolistic position to squeeze advantage for themselves. At this moment of crisis, it doesn't seem like the right moment to, just pragmatically, it doesn't appear to be the right moment to put the screws on.
Well, I mean, let me just push back on that just a little bit as we move into sort of like the second phase of this. And as we talk about sort of the I guess the water, starting to like pour onto the beach and into the low level ground, it almost seems like premature. But how we respond to what we do now is sort of built into how we respond now, right? I mean, so like we use the airlines as an example. On one hand, we're talking about how crucial they are. I mean, they're too big to fail, right? I mean, that is the argument essentially. And but at that point, like, one of the responses could be, hey, we just discovered something that's too big to fail. That's a job for government to do. Like, we're now going to have part of what you have because you have shown that we have established that this service, airlines, in 2008, it could have been banks, are crucial to the functioning of society. However, you have not been the proper steward for this service to society because you sucked, so much money out of your business to essentially line your pockets with buybacks and whatnot. We could have made the same argument about the Boeing 737 MAX. Folks know that story about how that was like, instead of putting it onto R&D and redeveloping that plane, they came up with this sort of big Band-Aid that sometimes slips off. We could at that point as a society say, like, we're going to have to own part of this because you have shown an inability to steward this, what we consider so crucial to our society, that we're willing to bail it out, this service.
I don't disagree. I mean, my personal favorite right now is the fossil fuel industry, in which I believe we could buy a controlling stake, the entire fossil fuel industry of the world, given the depressed price of oil and gas. And at this point, a couple of $100 billion puts you in a, which, in terms of the money that we've been throwing around here is peanuts, would give you an absolutely dominant shareholding position in all of the major oil and gas companies of the Western world at this moment. And from the point of view of addressing the climate crisis, which is clearly, the great crisis that we thought was going to dominate the headlines of this year, that would totally change the game. So the force of that, I think, is extremely compelling. There are two questions, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here, just for the sake of argument, that push back against that. The first is simply, in the crisis, is your priority to, as it were, save what can be saved, or to pursue transformation? And what is the price of pursuing a transformational agenda at this moment? Would you damage confidence even further? Would you have a larger investor strike if you were seen to be playing rough at this moment? And that, I think, is one of the concerns. And the second, of course, is that this is all entirely hypothetical, because the people in power in Washington, D.C. right now are stone-cold Republicans, and they have no interest whatsoever in pursuing this kind of argument. So it's a hypothetical. And one really needs to be asking oneself, how do you build a political coalition to push through this kind of transformational agenda at this moment? And is this crisis going to get us there? And after all, one of the kind of remarkable things of this moment is that the Sanders campaign folded, and it folded virtually without noise. It was almost the sort of just accompanying music in a scene that was entirely dominated by the urgencies of the crisis. That fundamental, a transformation, therefore, in the political complexion of the United States going forward into next year, because the choices are now between Biden and Trump, happened, without very little drama. And yet that, of course, decides the possibility of any of the sort of transformational politics that you and I might like, or that one might think of as being appropriate in this crisis.
Let me, I will certainly concede and knowing that you're playing the devil's advocate here, I'll certainly concede number two. Number one, I guess I would argue, is just that we're going through transformational politics, whether we like it or not. It's just a question of who gets to, who's in charge of what the transformation looks like, in my mind. And it does definitely feel like, there's really one side in this. One side is like, we're going to make it completely dominated by a couple of firms. And the other side is saying, it appears like you're going to make it completely dominant. I mean, there does not seem to be two sides to the argument here as we see now.